Hello, everyone. We're going to get today's panel started. On behalf of everybody at EXPO Chicago, welcome to Dialogues, our series of conversations, discussions, and provocative artistic discourse with leading artists, curators, and arts professionals on the issues that engage them. The program is presented in partnership with the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. My name is Stephanie Cristello. I'm the programming manager here at EXPO Chicago. I'm also the editor-in-chief of The Scene, Chicago's international journal of contemporary and modern art. Dialogues will be running concurrently for the next 2 days, so please come to one of the many panel discussions that we have planned. It is my distinct pleasure to present this panel entitled Biennale Biennial, moderated by Bruce Altshuler, director of the program in museum studies at New York University. He is the author of Biennials and Beyond, Exhibitions That Made History, 1962 to 2002, published in 2013, and Salon to Biennial, Exhibitions That Made Art History, Volume 1, 1863 to 1959, published in 2008. Both titles will be available at Phaidon booth 801, with a signing with Bruce directly following the panel. He will be joined in conversation with Dan Cameron, a bicoastal independent curator and founder of Prospect New Orleans, Anthony Elms, the chief curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art at the University of Pennsylvania and co-curator of the 2014 Whitney Biennial, and Irene Hoffman, Site Santa Fe's Phillips director and chief curator. There will be a brief question and answer period following the panel. We'll have a microphone for you on either side of the stage. We're also sourcing questions through Twitter if you'd like to tag us on our handle. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Does that sound okay? Yeah. Among the courses I teach is a course on contemporary art and its institutions. And a number of years ago, I assigned my students to go see the current Whitney Biennial, which was on at the time, obviously. I have a fair number of international students. And without exception, my international students, mainly from Latin America and, and Europe, came back with the comment, that was not a biennial, when they saw the Whitney Biennial. That is because their idea of a biennial was that of a themed exhibition in multiple sites with ambitious artist projects, and that was kind of widely international, which the Whitney Biennial is not. And that kind of contrast is one, among other questions, that we'll talk about tonight. The first biennial was created in 1895 in Venice, obviously the grandfather and mother of biennials, and it's Biennale. But most people don't realize that 1 year later in Pittsburgh, the Carnegie Museum, Andrew Carnegie, created another recurring exhibition that has become the Carnegie International. So really in the United States and in Europe, biennials have existed, alongside one another. Here in the U.S., the most well-known biennial is the Whitney Biennial. I have to check my dates here. Which first began in 1932 as an annual exhibition. In the 60s, this annual exhibition, which is an exhibition of painting and sculpture, and was designed to show what was new that was produced in this kind of avant-gardist mindset within the United States in the past year, became an exhibition that was sculpture 1 year and painting the other. And it alternated between the two till 1973, when it took its current biennial form. After the Second World War, we saw kind of another birth of biennials with the Sao Paulo Biennale in 1951 and documented in 1955. While very different shows, Sao Paulo being based on the Venice model, which was based on nations being represented by artists, in a way competing against one another for prizes, a model really rooted in that of international expositions of the 19th century. There was the model of Sao Paulo, and then Documenta, which was really not an exhibition that had artists representing individual countries, but rather was a show designed to initially kind of bring modern art and contemporary art back into the kind of German cultural scene after it had been kind of expunged by the Nazi regime, and also to work with the development of the city of Kassel, which was largely bombed out in the Second World War. So this kind of political motivation and economic motivation is one that we'll see in biennials that developed after that. The two greatest kind of developments within biennials, I think, following that period, was the development of the Thematic Exhibition. In 1972, the Venice Biennale in its central exhibition took on a theme, as did many, many international exhibitions like Documenta, which in 72 hired the curator Harold Zeman as its first single curator with a single vision of what the show was. As a result of sort of the vast increase in the number of exhibitions of contemporary art after the Second World War and the profusion of media coverage of them, it was felt that most people actually in the know, people who followed these things, knew what was sort of happening in contemporary art. So that function of the biennial started to be served by galleries, museums, etc. But what was felt was a need, the felt need was for some kind of interpretation of the art. And the whole development of thematic exhibitions began in the early 70s that has continued, and that really kind of dominates both the biennial world as we now know it. The next great development, of course, was globalism, the development of biennials outside the Euro-American centers. Starting with the Havana Biennial of 1984, right, was the first. This model of a biennial that was designed to bring into the international exhibitionary world art from outside Europe and North America that was spread across an entire sort of urban area that was held in conjunction with workshops, productions, performances, general kind of social events and social space. Really started to develop in 84 and 87, the Istanbul Biennial was created, and then through the 90s there was this kind of vast explosion of biennials, both outside the Euro-American centers and also in Europe and North America. The most recent of the ones in North America is one that Dan created in New Orleans, Prospect, New Orleans, that first iteration was in 2008, I think. So this sort of world we live in, where biennials are kind of central events of the contemporary art sort of ecosystem, is one that has a long history, but one that has a very sort of special character right now and a diverse character. And today we have three people who have been very actively involved in the curating of biennials, and they'll speak in the order in which they're sitting. The first, and I'll introduce them each before they speak. Dan Cameron, who, as I mentioned, most recently created created this most recent Prospect New Orleans Biennial, began in the 1980s as a very active independent curator and writer. I have to get your dates right, Dan, 1995 to 2006, right, was senior curator at the New Museum, during which time he was the artistic director of the 8th Istanbul Biennial, and he later was a co-curator of the 10th Taipei Biennial. And from 2012 to 2015, he was the chief curator of the Orange County Museum of Art. Now he is again an independent curator, working internationally. He's curated many, many exhibitions and has kind of amazing experience and knowledge of this field. So Dan.
Thank you, Bruce. Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I will dive right into some images, if I may. Well, okay, my name. I'm glad you brought up the Havana Biennial of 1984, because I feel that as someone who was inspired 5 years later, not by a biennial, but by the exhibition Magiciens de la Terre, which happened in 1989, and really introduced the global paradigm in a very formalized, almost manifesto-like way with a great deal of clarity, and for my generation of curators, changed the conversation completely. And I would say that it's such an important paradigm shift that we're still reacting to it. We are still in the field trying to figure out what to do as curators, as makers of exhibition, with the world in which everything is supposed to be interconnected, including us, including our practice and all the artists we know and all the exhibitions they have and all the works they make, which, when you think about it, doesn't really make much sense. And yet, at the same time, the paradigm continues to be a very persuasive one. So I was going to quickly talk about my work as a curator of 3 different biennials. This is the Istanbul Biennial in 2003. I was invited to do the exhibition while the smoke was still coming up from where the World Trade Center had been. And we opened the exhibition just a few months after the Allied forces began bombing Baghdad, which is a neighboring capital, to Turkey. So everything about the atmosphere of this was kind of like late Bush II, and the sort of paranoia in the world political scene at the time. I titled the exhibition Poetic Justice, for reasons that I thought would simply just keep reverberating, and invited artists like Jennifer Steinkamp, who came to Istanbul and used the Medusa head, upside-down Medusa head, in the old Roman cistern to create an image that she felt was very Medusa-like, where it projected animation of giant trees would shiver Disney-like, and their branches would not be like so much like vegetation or like trees, but really like living snake-like objects in this massive atmospheric space. It was the 550th anniversary of the expulsion of the infidel, which we sometimes refer to as the fall of Constantinople. And we got to use the Hagia Sophia, which will never happen again, and it certainly never had happened before. But artists like Tony Fayer could do something like suspend a single bottle, plastic bottle halfway filled with water, from 80-foot-high eaves above, and just have it practically vanish in the middle of this endless space. Arya Rastramransuk from Chiang Mai made an installation in the Hagia Sophia of one of her early performances involving cadavers that she would read poetry to and kind of work them through the early stages of the post-life existence that they would have. Then we got to work with a space like the Topane, which is an historic site used as kind of a military base for early Ottoman rulers. Danica Dakic, I'm blocking your view of this. I just realized you can't see it, and I'm twisting around. She had a piece where people lie back onto this sort of sofa and watch a projection above on the ceiling where people literally go through a pantomime of worshiping in 5 different faiths, according to music and visual representation and motifs that go along with it. So again and again, the artists in Poetic Justice tried, I think, to respond to this moment, this kind of paralyzing moment where something really, really awful was unfolding, and everyone had tried to do whatever they could to either pretend it wasn't going to happen or to try to prevent it from happening if they could, and yet it was happening anyway. And so those months in 2003 were very perilous ones for a lot of people. Monica Bonvicini linked 2 floors of the main space with a stairwell held up only by heavy gauge chains, and it was actually surrounded by bulletproof glass that she then smashed with a sledgehammer and called it Stairway to Hell. And this is probably the piece you would know from the biennial if you've ever seen the images. Doris Salcedo created a work with about 1,400 secondhand wooden chairs that had been really gathered from the corners of the country and put into place in a very precise armature, but which gave the illusion of complete chaos. And her idea structurally was that, she was trying to signal that moment when a society goes from not being at war to being at war, and do you ever really know the difference from one state to the next, or does it happen so subtly and by gradations that you don't really know you're at war until you're in the thick of it? So a little bit after Istanbul, I got invited to do Taipei, which was the first international biennial in Asia. It was preceded by the Pacific Asia Triennial in Brisbane, but Taipei kind of got there first in terms of making a international biennial point of view that would be Asian-oriented, but cover the entire world. So I kind of wanted to invite artists dealing a lot with the Western relationship to Eastern spirituality and spiritual systems. It was called Dirty Yoga, and many artists, I think, were kind of Lee Bull, for example, from Korea, was making these elaborate miniature scapes that would be comparable to what a filmmaker would use to create films in these kinds of settings, but without having to go to the actual environments to do so. Vivan Sundaram, who lives in India, creates a lot of work in which photographs from his predecessors, especially an aunt who left India and lived for many years in Paris as a modernist artist and then came back to India and had a very decisive role, I think, in kind of bringing Paris modern art to contemporary India. She and her sisters are looking and interacting with each other from different moments in their lives, from different family photos taken from different decades and then layered on top of each other to form one sort of composite life in a single space. This is actually Koki Tanaka, who is a young Japanese artist who moved from Tokyo shortly after this exhibition and now is my neighbor in Los Angeles. But he made a wonderful piece where he took the exhibition budget, bought a lot of simple things from stores, from cheap discount stores, made funny video vignettes with them, and then tried to convince people to take the things home with them from the exhibition. And people seemed really reluctant to just pick things up off of a museum and cart them out the front door. So eventually, he had to take them home himself. Katrina Grossa kind of created an intervention that was inside and outside the lobby. It's a painting, but it's a painting that occurs in 3 dimension and actually involves elaborate sculptural underpinning to make the illusion convincing of what it's actually trying to convey, which is a 2-dimensional experience, or a feeling of a 2-dimensional experience, but happening in 3 dimensions. And then finally, Regina Silveira created a work called Saga, in which for her the real human story is movement from one place to another, and she felt the way to capture that is to simply show the trace of those footsteps as they pass through the human landscape, or in this case, throughout the ventilating systems of the Taipei Fine Arts Museum. So my third example is going to be about Prospect. It's something I started shortly after Katrina. Pardon me. It was fundamentally a humanitarian invention in many ways, in the sense that there seemed to be so much opportunity within the art community to try to do something for New Orleans, but so few avenues to do it. And I happen to be one of the few people in the art world active as a curator who had spent an enormous amount of my own time in the past in New Orleans, including with the art community. So it was very kind of easy for me, or comparatively easy, to work in New Orleans during the post-Katrina environment, despite the fact that the city really remained largely in ruins for more than a year and a half after the floods. So this was the map of Prospect. It was presented as a really touristic image. You would see it like you would see a World's Fair. You would travel through the city as a large open-air gallery. For Prospect 1, we wanted everything free. So the venues were free, but we also had shuttles taking you all around the lower Ninth Ward and throughout the city for free. And then we really wanted the historic past of the venues to kind of shine through the present day image of a biennial or of a contemporary art project. And I think in this particular instance, although a lot of people have quibbles, and very good reason for having those quibbles about contemporary art and tourism, I think in this particular case, it was understood as being very appropriate. What you see down in the lower right of the corner is the lower Ninth Ward, which functioned as a single open-air venue with about 13 separate artist projects. Skylar Fine is a young artist who became an artist as a result of Katrina. He was actually in New Orleans for pre-med studies, and he got very interested in the largest unsolved mass murder in the United States, which happened to be the arson of a gay bar in the French Quarter in 1973, where 38 people lost their lives and no one was ever charged for the crime. Because it happened when it happened, most of the details about the crime and the victims themselves were really swept under the rug. And so what Skylar Fine did was kind of wanted to bring back the atmosphere of what it was like to be a closeted gay person in Louisiana in the the early 70s when, although it was taking the rest of the country a lot of time to catch up to Stonewall, in New Orleans, Stonewall hadn't happened yet. This, in effect, was the city's own Stonewall. So this kind of idea of this sort of straight beefcake imagery coming from Cosmo and Playgirl suddenly winding up being consumed by gay men looks very anachronistic to us today, but it wasn't. That was the reality of that period. Tony Fitzpatrick, Chicago's own great eloquent collage maker, is one of the deepest New Orleans freaks I have ever met. He loves the city with a devotion that makes me feel casual about it. And he devoted 2 years of work after Katrina to simply making visual representations of the symbolism of the city and what it meant for him. This is the Marigny moth. Mark Bradford from Los Angeles very famously constructed a 3-story arc in the lower Ninth Ward. He did it from his studio in South Central LA, but then transported it by truck. And if you're wondering why the plywood forming the outside of the arc actually has posters and handbills on it, it's because he didn't want to clean them. He wanted them to come from LA to New Orleans in the state that they would have been seen by people in Los Angeles, and then the weather over time would strip the handbills off the surface of the arc. Wageshi Mutu, who is normally known as a painter and sculptor, responded to New Orleans by working with one woman who lost her house in the lower Ninth Ward and then was cheated by contractors who kind of poured her an inferior foundation and then took off with the rest of her insurance money. So the house that was built was first made as a frame that was presented and could be visited at nighttime when these lights that were on a skeleton of the house would go on and you would see sort of a ghost house. And then that image became the basis of a fundraising drive so that about a year after Prospect ended, the house was, Miss Sarah got her house back, thanks entirely to the efforts of one of the artists who was participating in the exhibition. So this idea that art could actually play an active role in revitalizing New Orleans after such an incredible catastrophe had taken place was really at the heart of what so many artists did. Gajin Fujita, who's based in LA, but born and raised in Japan, happened to be in town when the Saints won a home game. And if you've ever been in New Orleans when the Saints have won a home game, there's really nothing quite like that instant transformation of the entire civic body as one. And so in homage of that experience, he represented the Saints as sort of a universal future kind of kabuki troubadour. He says it's the 23rd century. I'm not sure how. I guess it's indicated somewhere. And then we also wanted to focus a lot of the attention back to New Orleans, which is the home of very rich vernacular art traditions like the Mardi Gras Indian tradition, in which the big chief, in this case Victor Harris, who's the chief of Fayayay, has been masking and creating his own, much more African-based than most Mardi Gras Indians, suits, which make their debut on Mardi Gras morning and are worn for Mardi Gras Day and then St. Joseph's Day and then maybe once at Jazz Fest and then they're put away forever. And so we wanted to recognize that even though this was an occasion-based art form, that in fact the results could be understood and appreciated and loved as contemporary art sculpture, which is a little bit of a rewarding of the way it's referenced locally, but it nevertheless, I think, spoke very well to the out-of-town visitors. Prospect had about 50,000 visitors for the first edition and about the same amount for the second edition and quite a bit more for the third edition. And then the fourth edition of Prospect will open with Trevor Schoonmaker as the artistic director 2 years from now, so keep posted. I just want to finish up by showing the work of Narvin Rawanchaikul, also from Thailand, who wanted to celebrate the work of Navin Kimball, who died. He had to leave the city. He was evacuated to Georgia, died in Georgia several months after the storm, and didn't get a jazz funeral, which our artist from Thailand decided to rectify. So he collaborated with the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Foundation and the Preservation Hall Jazz Band, for which Narvin Kimball was the founding banjo player, and did a citywide publicity campaign with billboards and paintings. And then on the opening day, of Prospect One, he had his 3-year late jazz funeral led by our guest artist from Bangkok. So I think that's the last image I have to show you. But for me, it was very interesting to, as someone who had done biennials professionally, I thought the last thing I would ever do was disturb New Orleans, which was my place to go and get away from the art world and have fun, that it would suddenly become a place where I would try to create a biennial of a very different direction than what I've been doing up till now. So those are my images, and now thanks, and over to Anthony. Thank you.
So thanks, Dan. Next speaker is Anthony Elms, who's a curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia. Before that, he worked here in Chicago at Gallery 400 and the Renaissance Society. He's a writer and an artist himself, and in 2014 was one of the co-curators of the Whitney Biennial, curating the second floor, as I remember. So, there you go.
Thanks. All right. I guess trying to think. I'm going to try to keep super brief, not really talk about too many projects specifically, and just say that in a peculiar way, I don't want this to sound harsh or anything, like I don't travel for biennials. I don't see a lot of biennials. They're not things that tend to draw me. I see biennials when I travel, and they're happening when I'm traveling, but I don't go out of my way to see them. So it was never my intention, never my dream to do a biennial, which is maybe why I got asked. I don't know. And I was also asked to do the Whitney Biennial, which is, has been alluded to, like slightly different from a lot of biennials. It's not international, it's national. At one point, it was the only one. I'm not sure if it's still the only one that's housed completely within a collecting museum, so that there is a connection to a collection into what is or is not going to end up in the museum's walls after the biennial. It wasn't started as like a civic idea or as a larger, it was started as a way for the Whitney to decide what American artwork was before American artwork had a statement. And initially, anybody could apply to it and anybody could be shown, like nobody was turned away. Then it slowly became a curated exhibition and became an annual. I mean, initially, people's phone numbers, addresses, and prices would be on the walls next to the artwork. Then when it started being curated, it was curated anonymously by a panel that was pretty much stayed consistent for about 10 years and had their little routine for how they picked people from different regions. And then it turns into a sort of curated, authored exhibition. So it's a strange and kind of young biennial, I guess, in that way. And then on top of that, they added us the trouble for us, like the very practical trouble of like 3 curators asked to do their own independent thing, not with independent spaces and not with independent budgets. And so it was an interconnected show, and it's at this, I mean, when we talk about things being biennials, what it actually means is you probably only have really 8 months to work on the show, because the rest of the time is actually catch up and like trying to implement these ideas that you've had. So it's, you add that time constraint to 3 people going 3 different directions and not really talking to each other, and it was a very constrained thing. But as someone who doesn't go to biennials a lot, I guess, and doesn't really think about them, I mean, for myself, I mean, yeah, one of the critiques of the biennial is that it's not international, and is that it doesn't have the large, ambitious civic projects, et cetera. And I have to admit, these are all things that as I started reading the criticism of it, there are things that I actually thought were positives, actually. I'm not that interested in scale. I'm not that interested, so I just started asking very basic questions for myself of how big does ambition, like, what's the scale of ambition? Like, how big does it have to be? How small can it be? Why does ambition have to be bright, shiny, and large and imposing? And why can't it be something more intimate? Like, why do biennials have to be expansive? Why can't there be something that looks in and maybe be interesting? I'm not going to lie and say I figured it out perfectly or not, but so that everything that was, everybody that I worked with worked at a scale, like they did their work largely within their own hands, and everything was done by one person and at the scale of like what one person can do. I mean, so everything had component parts. Like if it got large at a small, handheld, one-to-one relationship. And it seemed to make sense to me, like for the space, for the way that they were asking us to do it, for the way that the budget was working. And it just seemed something that inherently made sense. And it also, to me, I just kept thinking, they gave us a spreadsheet of the biennials from years past and all the artists who had been in the Whitney Biennial from 2012, and it went down to, I think, 84. And you could see how many names appeared again and again and again, and you could see how many names you couldn't remember, you were really fighting to remember. And so this became a question to me also of just thinking through who is and is not there, and how, like, does it matter, like on one level it doesn't matter if you're international, national, or regional, if you're recycling the same things that have been there, like, or if the person hasn't changed what they do personally, given the environment. So this is just a selection of, I mean, like, this is public collectors, people might know locally. I guess, just to name some: Charlene von Heil, a desk designed by Paul P., Elijah Berger, Carol Jackson, Academy Records in the corner, another Paul P., a video room for My Barbarian, and Steve Ranke with Jesse Mott. Susan Howe, poet with these very small letterpress poems in the show. Public collectors again. Valerie Snowbeck, Catherine Sullivan, Gary Indiana. The very top, the sort of plates, are Terry Atkins, sort of last piece that he was working on when he died. Small notebooks, travel notebooks that Ellen Sekula kept while he was working on his larger projects and working in, like, little sort of jokes that he would write about the projects that he was working on. Rebecca Morris painting. And then there were things that, because it was the last biennial in the Brower building, I also just wanted to sort of have fun with the space. So this is Joseph Grigley's project involving Gregory Badcock, who's a famous art critic, who a lot of his polemical texts stem around artists and shows that happened at the Whitney. So it made sense to bring his personal artifacts and his personal dealings with artists and other critics back to the space, since this was the space for the heated conversations that he was working on. Paul P., who I knew that the building was being given to the Met, and Paul P. was spending every day at the Met drawing the same sculpture over and over and over again for 2 years. And so bringing sort of the Met to the Brower building before it actually came to the Brower building. Michelle Adair, artist who's been documenting New York skyline since 1969. And then Zoe Leonard, who turned a room of the 4th floor into a large camera obscura to sort of bring that sort of view from Madison that will never be a part of the Whitney again, actually into the space. And this was the largest piece, I guess, that I worked on, and I liked the fact that the largest piece was actually only created by a 6-inch lens and plywood. And so, like, it takes the most space, but with, like, the least, well, with a lot of labor, but with the least sort of material. But then it was really important to me, like, given the scale, like, I had a month and a half of performances, and everything involved, because I wanted the sort of politics to be people in front of people, and people operating at the scale of the human voice. So a lot of the things were only amplified enough to be, like, at a sound level of a human speaking. So this was a world premiere of a Robert Ashley opera, the creation of a Robert Ashley opera that he meant to do in 1972 with Marcia Tucker and never got around to. And so we actually staged it for its first time as he intended. And then a Spanish language version of Perfect Lives that was changed from the Indiana-Illinois border to the Texas-Mexico border, done in Spanish and with new music and new sort of characters. There was also a week-long performance of Taisha Padgett sort of doing these invocations throughout the space. Miguel Gutierrez did the first of a 3-part series of trying to think through what it is to be a mid-career artist, trying to still keep going. And then My Barbarian doing a series of workshops and performances. So that was the performance thing. But it was really trying to, I have to weirdly, like, trying to take the scale actually sort of the opposite direction of what's usually thought of as how you operate. And for myself, I guess it's just, and part of it I was thinking, like, when I think of shows that changed me or that I thought about, probably only 2 or 3 of them are biennials, like, from the history. It's like solo exhibitions that I'm looking through. It's like thematic or historical looks at regions. And so I just tried to think, rather than rising to the occasion of what's supposed to be rising to the occasion of a biennial, thinking, what are the scales of shows that have actually made me think about things differently, and using that as a marker of how to move into another direction. And hopefully the artists as well. And I think that's it.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. So our next speaker is Irene Hoffman, Director and Chief Curator of Site Santa Fe, where she's been since 2010. Before Site Santa Fe, she was the Director and Curator for 5 years at the Contemporary in Baltimore. And she's had a slew of earlier museum work. So she has a great deal of experience working in museums and now running a biennial. Irene.
Thank you, Bruce. Running a biennial and running an institution, which is part of what the story that I want to just share with you in a few minutes of a 20-year history of a biennial that was begun in a town, in a city that is really at the periphery in a lot of ways, and how this biennial over the course of 20 years has in many ways tried to reinvent itself a number of times, most significantly in the last 5 years since I've been there. So Site began in 1995 with the idea of creating what at the time would then be the only international biennial in the United States. And of course, there were at the time just only a handful, as we heard from Bruce earlier, internationally. And it was an opportunity to really bring the international art world, international contemporary art, to this small town in New Mexico, a place where art had long had a very important place. We do not live in a city where you have to convince your audience that art is important. However, contemporary art really did not have much of a foothold in Santa Fe in 1995 when the first show was staged. So this was the first exhibition. Bruce Ferguson, whoop, we're going a little too fast, staged an exhibition in what was an old Coors beer distribution warehouse. This is about a 20,000 square foot space that held this first international biennial at Site. And the response to that first exhibition, the community that really formed around the institution, kick-started what not only that now has become the signature exhibition at Site, this biennial, but it really launched an institution, a year-round institution of contemporary art. So over the years, curators like Dave Hickey put their mark on the building and the institution. Lance Fung, whoa. Well, it has a mind of its own. Okay. Dave Hickey, 2001. Lance Fung, now this is Lucky 7, 2009. I swear I didn't press that. So, I arrived 5 years ago at Site Santa Fe at a time when I think there was a lot of discussion in the field about where biennial making was. For our institution, 15 years in, 8 biennials, there was a lot of conversation around what might the future of Site's biennial be. At a moment where now there were maybe 150 plus biennials around the world. Where did this institution fit in? What could Site contribute? So many amazing exhibitions had been hosted at Site through our biennial cycles. And yet the model of a single curator coming to Santa Fe, having not that many months, as has been mentioned, to put on an exhibition. Is that the model for our future, and is that what we wanted to continue to do? And so, what we did at Site was actually suspend our biennial cycle for a year, which was jarring for our institution and our community. But I think it let people know we were very serious about looking at where biennials were in general and in particular with our institution. I brought together 2 generations of curators from all over the world that had curated all the major biennials that had been around to date. and brought them to Santa Fe for a conversation about what was happening in the field. And there was some incredible, very frank discussion among two generations of curators about the challenges of hosting biennials, of being asked to create a biennial. A lot of it had to do with institutional infrastructure. A lot of it had to do with time. A lot of it had to do with research. And we collectively, what came out of this discussion, I can best describe as a kind of restlessness in the field about biennials, and that this model of a single curator coming to a place, especially like Santa Fe, with such a rich history already, almost sort of parachuting into our community and creating an exhibition of bringing art from the outside, wasn't something that we necessarily wanted to continue, because we were hearing from those very curators how unsatisfying that could be with such a short time to actually engage with the institution and with the place. It's also incredibly challenging for the artists that those curators want to bring. Imagine being invited to come to a place that has such a strong history and being asked to make a work in response to that place with very little time, and often very little money. And so for SITE, what we really wanted to look at was how could we change the infrastructure at the institutional level to try to give greater support to the curators who would work with us and to the artists. So along with that was really trying to recalibrate SITE's focus. In Santa Fe, we sit on the Pan American Highway. For me, coming from Baltimore 5 years ago, this was a pretty extraordinary kind of moment, seeing the signs for the Pan American Highway along, whoa. Yeah. And this notion that we were connected in Santa Fe with a single road that traveled to the north to Alaska and the south to Tierra del Fuego was pretty extraordinary. Similarly, the history of the land was pretty powerful for me moving to this place. Of course, this was first native land. This was also a Spanish kingdom. It was a Mexican province and an American territory, all before becoming a state. And as such, is really an incredible microcosm of the Americas. In the population in Santa Fe, there are people who trace their histories back to those different moments. So that became a very powerful two kind of sets of geographic and historical markers for us as we started to think about shifting the axis of a biennial from one that is predominantly east-west to one that would shift north to south. And with that, we changed the focus of our biennial to one that would look at contemporary art from the Americas. So we go from global and international to hemispheric and look at the entire of the Western Hemisphere. Looks like you've got the background on my slides a little in white, or in black, so you can't quite see everything. Sight Lines, New Perspectives on Art of the Americas is the new name of our biennial that continues now with the first exhibition that opened last summer. With an exhibition we called Unsettled Landscapes. Here are the artists. You can see there are artists, 45 artists from 17 countries, 3 generations of artists. 4 curators put together this exhibition, and every future exhibition in this series will be a team. We are interested in really bringing more curatorial voices to the table and giving an opportunity to look at perspectives that are not often included in international biennial exhibitions. Just a few views of our first show. Unsettled Landscapes looked at landscape, territory, and trade, and those experiences as shared throughout the Americas. Juan Downey, before you saw Liz Cohen, Kent Monkman, and I think my last slide is Inigo Manglano Ovalle. I didn't press any of those. So I guess I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, guys. I'm just looking at our time, and I want to leave time for questions, so maybe we can just use questions from the audience as a way to take off in our discussion.
I have a microphone here, so I'll be right over.
Thank you. It seems to me, this is for you, Anthony. I wonder, what is your objection to the large scale Biennale? It looks to me this is kind of the issue between an elitist museum show and a populist over-town show. I hear like New Orleans, that was a wonderful achievement of the art being part of life rather than a separate discipline. And just for the elite, those that can afford going to a museum. I myself installed in Örebro, Stockholm, Sweden, and they had, our installation had environmental ideas, and a lot of the people who are very apathic and non-caring, provincial, did stop and learn, kind of increase their awareness through seeing the art. They couldn't avoid it. It was all through town. So why is this objection?
That's not an objection to me. Like, I don't have a problem with like the artwork being cited around civically, but like there's just a scale of exhibition that tends to not be interesting to me. I mean, I have a hard time concentrating at art fairs, given the amount of time and the out of, like, it's not saying that it's horrible, but it's like my attention span is more one-to-one, and I think it's wrong to assume that just because something's on the walls of a museum, museums are public spaces, the public goes to them. 129,000 people saw the Whitney Biennial. I don't know 129,000 people. So they have free hours. They have, the performances that we were done, usually a ticket to a Robert Ashley piece is about $50. If you paid your entrance fee to the Whitney, you got to see it for free, and you didn't need to reserve a ticket. Like, it was there, and it was performed 3 times a day, much more than they're normally performed. So we used the subsidy of like the museum as a structure to make some things that are often presented in smaller rundown spaces actually much more public than they often are. Miguel Gutierrez did an hour-and-a-half long, 2-hour dance piece 3 times a day, 4 times on the longer days of the Whitney for 3 weeks. But like, more people saw that piece than have seen his pieces before. So it's like, it's not, my objection isn't to like public versus anti-public or out in the space, but it's more like, Miguel Gutierrez's piece was seen by thousands of people, but it was seen by thousands of people, 45 people at a time. So 45 people were there in a small room with him, able to hear him speak one-to-one, rather than up on a stage, 200 feet away, to have that same experience of 1,000 people seeing him. So for me, it was just it's an issue of scale. It's not where or how something functions, it's the scale that, I was reacting against.
And this also brings up a larger question, which is sort of how biennial practice over the years has started to affect museum practice. Because in museums, you're seeing changing kind of exhibition formats, changing ways of sort of integrating all sorts of things that used to be considered ancillary, performances, lectures, investigations, research projects, into the texture of exhibitions. Maybe you guys could just talk a little bit about how you've seen museums change in reaction to biennials.
Well, I think one of the things that I would say that seems to be almost self-evident is that, a curator usually distinguishes herself or himself through museum programs. If you're working at an art center, or an institute of contemporary art, or a museum of modern or contemporary art, and then through a sustained practice over time, your public and you connect in an intense way, and word gets out there, and then somebody says, hey, maybe that person would be great for the next Lyon Biennial or the next Sydney Biennial. which is really how it happened. So the idea that they're separate to begin with is a little bit of a misnomer, because I don't really know any biennial curators who don't primarily identify themselves as museum practitioners.
And I would also add that at site, the biennial has changed the institution, in that the way in which we've gone about rethinking how we will work more collaboratively, multiple voices, many more people at the organizational and curatorial table to produce our biennial exhibition, that has also impacted then how I run the institution, how we're making decisions curatorially. So I think, or even just how we are facing, not just looking for validation to sort of New York or elsewhere, right? We're actually looking to our community and facing the audience more. So that came out of our work on the biennial.
And I think there's a way in which, I just opened on Wednesday an exhibition that I've been wanting to do for 15 years and worked on for 3.5 years. And so it's not, so biennial, whether it's in a museum or not, there is like the time crunch and the time scale makes you recalibrate things at a different register. And it's, I don't know if that's anti, it's like it was really useful for me on one level as a technique or something to like suddenly have to work at a different speed, different rhythm, it was a good way to sort of break something and then start again. But it's not anti that. It's like, it's a complex, like interweaving. Yeah.
Any more questions? Just looking good out there.
This will probably be the last question. Thank you.
It's a very simple question. I just wanted to know more about the difference between Biennale and biennial, because throughout the entire dialogue, everyone only spoke in biennial. So I'm kind of wondering, under what context would you say you use Biennale instead, or if it's interchangeable, or?
Well, I was using the term biennial, which is really a generic term, for a regularly recurring exhibition. An exhibition held, whatever that time period is, it could be yearly, but generally 2 years, 3 years, 5 years in the case of Documenta. And I think this opposition between Biennale and biennial is really meant to kind of allude to the variety of models there are out there. So I just lapsed into saying biennial. But if I'm talking about Venice, it's Venice Biennale, because that is the actual name of it. So I don't.
Exactly. One word is Italian, and the original biennial is the Biennale di Venezia. But I think that biennial does, as Bruce just said, it kind of suggests the endless permutation of the model. Mm-hmm. Prospect New Orleans is happening every 3 years, but so far the idea of calling it a biennial doesn't seem to have changed in terms of people's habit. It's like, well, we're the biennial that happens every 3 years. So I think biennial has now become a phenomenon or something occurring in the field, and Biennale has a very specific, concrete definition that we're all pretty comfortable with. And that's probably the biggest working distinction, maybe.
Okay, well, let me thank our panel. That was really fantastic, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bruce.